The social media algorithms, they're not trying to radicalize us, they're just trying to keep us at the computer. And so they'll put up flashes of pretty people and pretty scenery and, and do all these things to try to keep us there, but they find that the controversy keeps us there. Once they see what we find important, then they just try to make it a little bit more controversial, and they're not being surgical about it. They're just saying, I want you to stay at the computer. And it works. If it's controversial, it turns out that controversial topics that you care about will keep you at the computer more than pretty people, more than pretty scenery, more than cute kittens. And social media didn't create that about us. It just found that that works.
Hi, I'm Glenn from Speak Life. We like to see all things through the lens of Jesus. Today I am joined by the Faithiest atheist himself, Richard Suttles, on the line from Arizona. Thanks for joining me.
Man, thank you so much for having me, Glenn.
Now, you have been interacting with the Speak Life channel for, we were thinking just before we pressed record, about 6 or 7 years, something like that?
Yeah. Yes, I have.
How did you come across Speak Life to begin with?
So I've been following apologetics since the 80s. I'm 52, so I was a teenager in the 1980s. And in my youth group, back in the 80s, we didn't really know what apologetics was, but I was having questions. I was starting to have doubts in my church. And my youth pastor gave me a Scaling the Secular City book, and it had just come out in 1987. And that was an apologetics book, Scaling the Secular City. J.P. Moreland.
Ah, right, yeah.
And I'd love to meet him one day because, I'd love to say his book is my first. But that was when I first heard of apologetics. And so to get to your answer, I started following apologetics then as a Christian, became an atheist later. But sometime around 2010 or 11, I began to really start looking, and I really started pushing this idea of morality and righteousness, this feeling that something that we all suffer from. And there were so many Christians that were like, no, Christianity will solve that. And there were so many atheists that were like, no, atheists will solve that. I finally saw that you were talking about some of the books that I had been reading. I would say from 2009, one of the first books that really started talking about this was Thinking Fast and Slow. And then I think Jonathan Haidt's book, maybe it was 2011, 2012. So for those years, I had been pushing this, and apologists and atheists were like, nah, this is crazy. And I wasn't getting any traction, but you were reading those books. And so I started watching your shows and saying, yeah, this is this. Because you were saying, hey, this is a human thing. This isn't something that this isn't something that if you join Christianity, it's going to go away, nor is it something that if you walk away from Christianity or deconstruct, is it going to go away. This is something that we all struggle with. And I'm like, yeah, this is my message. And so you were the first one. You were the tip of that spear. And so that's why.
So that's, like 11 years ago, The Righteous Mind came out by Jonathan Haidt. And he was noticing what it is that divides us in so many ways, and we have these righteous minds, and we cannot help but seek after a kind of a righteousness. And so I don't know why all Christians don't kind of resonate with that, because to me it sounds like a very it sounds like life in Adam, to use some very kind of biblical terms, that we are ineradicably religious kind of beings who want to orbit around some kind of totem pole, and that kind of morality binds us and blinds us, and the Bible's all over this sort of stuff. And so I was picking up on stuff like a saying we're always saying here at Speak Life is, what the heart loves, the will chooses, and the mind justifies.
Yes.
And the order is important, but the mind comes at the end.
Right. And it goes for us just as much. And, I have so much arguments with atheists who think, no, you misunderstand. Once I became an atheist, I left all that behind, and now I'm just purely reasonable. And Jonathan Haidt has another lecture called The Rationality Delusion,
yes,
which he uses the same qualifications that Richard Dawkins does for the God delusion. And he says, okay, if these are the qualifications that make something delusional, then rationality, or at least pure reason, is also a delusion.
Right.
And he's saying it's not that we can't ever reach the truth, but this idea that we're all rationally going through our problems just using pure reason is a delusion itself.
Right.
That's another piece from Jonathan Haidt. And it has to do with all humans. So I argue with atheists about this maybe as much as you do with Christians. This is something we should all say. We all suffer from this.
And because what it helps us do is actually engage with people on the other side of debates, because one of the three major analogies that Jonathan Haidt uses in that book is that our intuitions are like an elephant that are heading in a certain direction, and our rationality is like a rider on top just yapping away, but the rationality on top yapping away is not like, who's really in charge of this beast? It's right, kind of the intuitions that are leading us on, and that kind of, how does that help you? Because you've got this, you even call it a ministry. We might get into why you call it a ministry.
I do. I say that I'm evangelizing, and I call it a ministry. And and I was raised Southern Baptist. Even though I walked away from Christianity, I'm still a Southern Baptist.
Yeah, you're a Southern Baptist atheist. Yeah, absolutely. It's the air that we breathe, Richard. It's the air that we breathe. And so you have this, let's call it ministry of kind of, you unite people on your Facebook page in terms of there's atheists and there's Christians and there's all sorts, in between, thinking about how to have better conversations about these things. Tell me specifically, how does the elephant and its rider and understanding that the intuitions go first, how does that help you have better conversations?
Well, the first thing I do is try to share that same imagery with other people, whether they're Christians or atheists. And sometimes there's a lot of pushback. Very often they'll agree because they can see it so clearly with other people, with people who disagree with them. They're like, oh, yeah, you're right. People do act like that a lot. I see it in so many people. And it's very difficult for them to say, you know what, I see it in myself too. Man, I'm terrible at this. It's hard to get people to own up to that. So that I've noticed that. So I try to share the story. Then I see if they agree that they might have the problem. And then sometimes they'll say, well, does that mean that we can't find the truth or that there's no point in even trying? And so we have to have those conversations too. And my answer is that obviously we can reach the truth because we have air conditioning and satellites. And if we didn't have the truth, we'd never have air conditioning and satellites. And we do have those, so therefore we can get to the truth. My guess is that it takes a bunch of different parameters to have to come together exactly right in order for us to get to something like air conditioning and satellites. Otherwise, in fact, that might even be the reason why the original theist scientists, way back when the scientific methodologies became memorialized, it might be why they decided that empirical demonstration was so important, was they were like, man, we are all so certain we need to narrow this down to something that we can force each other to observe. That might be one of the only ways to get to the truth. My only point is that our certainty is so overwhelming that you got a lot of people marching through life saying, I've figured it out, I've got it. Atheists, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, everybody. And I think that's just a human problem. So I start with that imagery, and then I see how they handle it, and then if they're willing to agree that they might have it. And then my hope is that makes us a little bit more humble when we talk to each other.
Right. Yeah, I'm always saying that one of the big problems in the world, and I think this is a biblical angle on things, one of the biggest problems in the world is not people being wrong, it's people being right with a capital R, and being committed to that rightness. Right back, this sort of founding story, whatever you do with this story in Genesis 3, you've got this picture of idiot humanity kind of having done the forbidden thing. They then end up hiding from God, and then they end up, weaving together these fig leaves, which is a ridiculous covering. They've done the bad thing, but instead of coming clean about doing the bad thing, what do? They do the very human thing. Adam is a name that just means humanity. So what's humanity always doing? Humanity's always messing up, and humanity's always hiding, and then blaming the other guy for it. And Adam is just this comedy masterclass in blame shifting. This woman that you put here, God, he manages to blame both God and the woman in a single sentence. But this is what humanity is like right down to our fingernails, really.
And I try to say this with Christians and atheists, because Christians will often say, we're broken and we can't fix it on our own. And I try to tell atheists, we should be saying that too. And maybe from the atheist side, we can say, well, because evolution doesn't always push us towards the truth, it pushes us towards what works. Maybe the reason why we're broken and we can't fix it on our own is for two reasons. Maybe we need each other, You need like a social construct, not just yourself. And maybe we have so many biases that got us through life, and we're just a result of what worked, trial and error and luck for generations. Maybe that's why we're broken and can't fix it on our own. But Christians and atheists should be able to walk into a room together and each side say, we are broken and we can't fix it on our own. That should be our number one message. And I think some apologists and some atheists are like, if you get rid of those guys, then you will be able to fix it on your own. Everything will be fine. And I think that polarization is more of a problem than not.
Yeah. So tell me what you do with the Jonathan Haidt lecture that is online. The argument against what's his argument against rationality?
The rationality delusion.
The rationality delusion, right?
Yeah, and I would have to go back and watch it again. It's about 10 years old.
Yeah.
But his whole point, and it's a lecture in front of students. His whole point is that he goes to Richard Dawkins' God delusion and gets whatever those qualities are. I forget what they are. And then he says, okay, let's look into each one of those qualities, and then shows that we're guilty of it.
Right.
And then he says, okay, so now what do we do? And it didn't go over well with either apologists or atheists. A lot of people just pushed it away. I think he should have written a book about it, but he didn't. But I still send it to people, and sometimes people say, "Wow, that was really a wake up call," and some people say, "Well, he misses this." But for me, that really hit home, and it was it was soon after The Righteous Mind that he put that out, and it really, when I was online, I would say like around 2008, 2009 is when I got onto Facebook. By then, my wife and I, let's see. Am I doing the math right? Yeah. By then we had our first kid, and I'm on Facebook, and I'm reconnecting with all my high school friends and friends from the Marines, because I'd been in the Marines too. And that's where you get into the arguments, and I'm getting into those arguments, and I'm like, hey, you wake up, sheep, do your research, be like me. And then I see that, maybe 2012, 2013, and I had a coming to Jesus moment, and said, man, that is not how I should be doing business. And not to say that I completely changed, but from that day forward, I've tried to change. I struggled to change. And I hope I'm better at it now.
Yeah. Well, you are very good at it online. I've noticed one thing is that you're much more active on Facebook. You were sort of active on Twitter for a little bit. Have you found a difference between Twitter and Facebook?
Big time. I don't like Twitter. It seems like there's more mean people on Twitter. And it's also hard to keep the conversations organized. But whereas with Facebook, it's not great on Facebook either, but it's easier for me on Facebook. So yeah, I did give Twitter a shot, and then I just started narrowing it down until now I'm on maybe once every few months. So yeah, I don't really enjoy Twitter. I'm looking at Discord.
Yes. Those sorts of gated communities are really interesting because you don't get the performative thing. If you're behind closed doors and you're not doing the public performance of your outrage, it makes a huge difference.
Yep. So yeah, I am looking for other social media, but my biggest breakthrough has been in the past couple of years now. Churches are inviting me, and apologetics organizations are inviting me to come to their church and do a debate or discussion. So in the past few years now, I've gotten to meet some of the best apologists here over in the United States, hang out at church, hang out with their families, spend a whole weekend having conversations. That's really what I wanted to do. I wanted to change the topics because I've noticed that both apologists and atheists sometimes repeat arguments that intuitively worked for 10 years. And I'm like, there's some problems that you might want to tweak it a little bit. And give them an idea, drop stones in their shoes, like Greg Kokel says. I've really been trying to drop stones in shoes for the past few years now in person. That's been my biggest, most fulfilling part of my ministry.
Well, and the big question that everyone wants to know is why? Why, Richard? Why spend all this time kind of interacting with Christians?
Is that it?
Yeah. What's the big why question? Like, what's the motivation for doing this?
I think, I've had several life-changing moments that really made me feel like I had a lot of clarity and a lot of meaning. And if you ask me why we have meaning and morality, and real quick, just in 10 seconds, I just want to clarify there's something that I think atheists get wrong, is that even if there's not objective morality or objective meaning, I think we do perceive it. I think we do think, hey, wait, this is important. And so a lot of atheists will say, stop saying that, it's all subjective, we're all just doing our best. Even if that's true, part of us doing our best is perceiving this couple of layers or a couple of things where we're like, hey, man, you can't mess with this. This is important. And I think everybody perceives that. And so I wanted to get that clear as we talk about meaning and morality and things. There's been a couple of times in life where I've said, man, this is like a transformative, meaningful experience to me. And if you say, yeah, but it was all chemicals and biology, I'm like, okay, but it's got me. It's completely overwhelming, and I'm in its clutches. So I'm fooling myself, but I'm going with it. So I'm okay to admit that. But the one that really got me, and by the way, I work in the counterterrorism world, and so I get to read a lot of stuff. What I'm going to tell you now is not classified. This is just I'll remove enough details that it's not really there's nothing classified about what I'm about to tell you. But there were two people that I was reading. I was analyzing their justifications. So they're two intellectuals, scholars with your degrees, and they hated each other, and they were yelling at each other and saying, you don't appreciate philosophy, you don't appreciate logic, you don't understand beauty, you don't understand your own ideology. And they had the same ideology. They even had been raised in very similar conditions their entire life. So they were within an ideology that, like, you're raised from a boy to repeat this stuff and talk. And you're kind of built to be a leader as a boy in this particular world. You could probably guess what I'm talking about. But these guys were in their 90s, and they were screaming at each other, raised under the same denomination of their ideology, but they had fractured. And they were like, you don't understand beauty, rationality, logic, scripture, love, all of that.
You're talking about the two popes, aren't you, Richard? You're talking about the two popes. I get it.
You could say something where they at least saw themselves about that level, but they did see themselves as the ultimate advocate for what they were talking about. And they were in their 90s, and I knew enough about them historically to know that they were raised in almost identical conditions. And I said, and they hate each other, and they're miserable. And of course, they're bad guys, so we had to deal with their badness. But I also had some sympathy. Not that I could do anything to stop us dealing with them, and it turns out I didn't. But I felt some sympathy that these were two guys who were raised under identical conditions, and something else happened where they grew to hate each other in their 90s. And they had people who were like reading the justification going, oh man, he's totally got this guy's number. And that guy had his people going, oh, this is amazing. And so they're both plotting against each other. And on one level, it had kept them from focusing on us. And now they're focusing on each other. And I was like, man, there's something going on with humanity where even as smart as we are, we can have access to the same books and the same science and the same books on philosophy and modal logic and come up with completely contradictory points that can't be reconciled, or if they can, I don't know how, to such a degree that these guys would identify with that distinction, commit themselves to it, and put all their intellect into it and have followers. And I'm like, there's got to be something we can do to recognize that we might do this and try to stop it. So that was the day that I committed myself to, like, I'm going to get into this game and try to see if I can't bring down the vitriol a little bit. And so that was my meaningful experience. That was one of my life experiences where I said, this is something I need to be involved in. So that was one of my many experiences. But I think that's the one that really turned my eye towards this and wanted me to get into the game.
So you see the addictive quality of self-justification and the poisonous quality of self-justification. And now you say you want to be kind of part of what helps and heals that kind of addictive and poisonous self-justification. So what is it that can counteract that kind of self-justification?
One is that imagery that we were talking about how if we really are like the rider on the elephant and we think we're in control, we should probably be humble about how much work that elephant is doing. And there's so many books on this. I've because I work in radicalization in my counterterrorism world, because I focus on the cognitive activities in our brains that kind of lead people to get to this point. I've done a lot of research on this. And I just try to push that some of this stuff is outside of our activity, outside of our mental activity. So you could be the smartest guy in the world, and you could have read a lot of books from your stuff and your opponent's stuff, and you could still be part of it, because all that mental activity that you're putting could still be the same thing as the rider on the elephant. Even though the rider is really smart, the elephant's still going to go to the left. Or let's say the elephant is going to go to the water no matter what. You can say whatever you want to, but the elephant's going to go to the water. So pretty much you might have riders with an extremely brilliant explanation as to what's going on, but no matter what, the elephant's going to go to the water. And so I try to push that to say, just it could be, even though you're very, very smart, you could be guilty of this. Yes. And then I also try to tell myself, I could be guilty of this too. So even my desire to be part of this change for betterness could also become corrupt. So I try to keep my mind open to the fact that I could be doing damage, even though I think I'm doing good. So I try to keep open to that too, that I could also get some feedback one day that says, hey, you're causing problems. So I try to stay humble too.
Is there something to your personality that draws you to this as well? I know I kind of like to be the person who stands above the debate, and I can see the point that this person's making. I can see the point that person's making. But then I look back to, like, I was the youngest boy, and I've got two much older sisters, and there was conflict in the house, and I was always the cute little brother, the cute son, who could kind of bring peace by telling a joke and kind of smoothing over. And it's just interesting. I've sort of caught myself 30 years later, having a look at online theological debates, and I'm still trying to be the cute little brother, smoothing things over. Like, can you notice stuff in yourself about personality-wise why you're drawn to this kind of work?
Yeah, I'm very much a diplomat, and I think it finally hit me in the Marines, because the Marines don't want diplomats. They want you to obey orders and do what you're told. So when they realized I was a diplomat, in fact, when I told my dad I was going to join the Marines, the first thing he told me is, he said, one of them is going to kill you. And that became very close to what happened a couple times, because my dad was raised in military school, and he was like, you're not set for this. Not that you're not tough or whatever. My dad raised me to be fairly tough. But he said, but because I'm a diplomat rather than an order follower, he said, one of them is going to kill you because they're going to be so frustrated with you, which there were times when I was at least threatened with that. So yeah, I'm a diplomat, and so my diplomacy really helped out in the Marines. They didn't realize they needed me until there were a few occasions where it really helped to have me in the mix, and especially in Iraq. There were times in Iraq where I literally saved lives. Because I could help cooler heads prevail. So, yeah, the diplomacy is really the personality trait, and I really embraced it in the Marines in an atmosphere where they say it's not welcome, but I knew it kind of was. And that also helps me now, because sometimes I'll have atheists say, you know what, you're a secret Christian and you're pretending to be an atheist to bring us down. And then I have Christians saying, you're pretending to like us so that you can get in close and, stick in the knife when we're not paying attention. So I get both sides, not just critiquing me, but saying, you're actually doing evil things, and we know it, and we see that about you. I can take that and just brush it off and say, maybe so. If so, be careful. Watch out.
Right. So yeah.
I think the diplomacy helps me.
Yeah.
I got to be able to take a hit, and so I think those things really help me in this business.
You mentioned Iraq. It's interesting. To me, like one of the ways that the work of Jonathan Haidt struck me was thinking about how very culturally contingent and historically shaped our moral sensibilities happen to be. And I guess that's something that Jonathan Haidt was sort of going on a journey on. And I think coming as someone who is much more on the left of politics, he suddenly started to see that those who are on the left tended to foreground only sort of two of the moral taste buds in terms of care and fairness.
Yes.
Whereas those on the right of politics tended to have a more even spread, including things like authority. What are the other ones?
Tradition. Yeah, authority, tradition, purity. And now purity gets a bad word, but think about like this: if no matter what society you're in, if there's not some sort of standards, and if you're not sticking to those standards, you're going to have a hard time as a society. So purity gets a bad rap sometimes, but some things are important and they should be protected. So people on the right, the conservatives, used to really value that.
Yes. And I think sort of globally around the world and down through history, I think that there tends to be a more even spread across those sort of 5 or 6 moral foundations, however you count them. Whereas I think he's being clear in the years following that there's something peculiar about the West and about the Christian influence that tends to foreground the care and fairness kind of moral foundations. And this is where my thought about Iraq comes in, and whether 20 years ago we went into places like Iraq and Afghanistan and considered, okay, they will roughly have the same sorts of moral foundations as we have. They will see the world roughly the same as we have. And when we offer them the chance to have a liberal democracy, they'll, of course, accept that and embrace us as liberators.
Right. Very naive.
And it was quite naive, yeah. So join the dots.
And I
for
say
me
that
on
as
that.
a believer. Yeah, I say this as a believer who, by that time I was in my 30s. I fully believed in that. I thought we were doing the right thing. I saw it as noble. And I see now, 20 years later, that was very... And this came from interacting with them directly. And I was like, for them, the structure of the family and the community really overwhelms everything else. And that's probably not going to change. So that... And we didn't take that into consideration.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
It was naive.
Right. And the difference in the West, you would say... the predominant difference in the West would have been Christianity and Christianization, would you say?
Yeah, I would say that. Man, there's so many books I could talk about this. Not just the atheist historian guy. Not your Tom Holland. I guess you have both Tom Hollands, don't you?
That's true. We've got Spider-Man as well.
Yeah.
But the cool Tom Holland is the historian. Yeah.
You got both Tom Hollands. So the historian Tom Holland, I think he talks about that in his book. There's also another guy. Man, I've read so many books now, but. He has 2 books. One is called The Secret of Our Success. Joe Heinrich is his name.
Yeah, and the weirdest people in the world.
Yeah, those 2 books, he talks about that, about especially weirdest people in the world. He talks about how Christianity did that, trying to move us away from that structure where you have to, you have to follow this structural path. I mean, obviously, I guess Catholicism created another structure, but a lot of the Protestants certainly. And I've even seen anthropologists say the reason why Protestant, whatever the word is, the reason why that took off was because there were so many people who lived on land that they could take care of it themselves. And if you have the ability to grow your own food, you have more of ability to tell the authority to heck with you. And, you get a community together with their own land and you can feed yourselves, then you have more of a chance to push back on authority. And some anthropologists will say, whereas if you're stuck in the desert and you don't have those kind of resources, you might be more likely to give in to the authority. But now some people on the left have pushed back on that, and they said, okay, well, now you're just being racist. You're saying wherever you're born is going to kind of affect your morality, such that you're going to give in to authority just because you were born here, or you're going to be more independent because you were born here. So I see both angles of that. So I wanted to throw that out, that some anthropologists are trying to wonder why this idea would flourish in some countries and not. And anthropologists have said it's because of the resources you had available, and that could be a problem if you're if you're making a claim that somebody's going to be more or less one way because of how they're born. That's another problem to wrestle with.
Yeah, I'm perfectly content to say that there are all sorts of historical and geographical and climate issues that sort of, there are all sorts of historical contingencies, and then there's like technological shocks, like the printing press. You wouldn't have the Reformation without the printing press, at least not in the shape that it sort of happened. So there's all sorts of confluences of historical contingencies that might not have been.
Right. Yes, like Jan Hus. If Jan Hus had a printing press, then the Reformation would have gone 100 years earlier.
Yeah, no, completely. And I think those sorts of developments were continuous with some of the developments that were happening within medieval Christendom. So Larry Seidentop has written a book called Inventing the Individual, which if you haven't come across Inventing the Individual, that'd be a great. So he just goes back to classical antiquity and talks about family and institution and authority, and why, for an ancient person, of course, a society is made up of families, and that is the irreducible unit of the culture. With the paterfamilias, the father who is like the high priest of the household, and he tends the fire of the ancestors, and he raises up his firstborn son to take over his role as the first, and that is this indivisible atom of culture. And so how do we get to this position where today, obviously, the individual unit of society is the individual, this choosing individual who consents to be part of these voluntary associations, and we're all equal before the eyes of the law. How do you go from that to this? And he traces through a lot of different things, and he mentioned some of the Joe Heinrich stuff in terms of, the marriage and family program of Christianity, and how you just had to, once Christianity comes, you can't marry your cousin or your second cousin, third, it goes out to the seventh cousin, so that we're absolutely smashing those clan-based units. And now you've got to form associations based on consent. And then you have guilds, and then you have charter towns, and then universities, and you have all these sorts of associations that have to form on the basis of the consent of individuals rather than the basis of families and clans. And you've got an ideological thing, I would say, as well, in terms of, we are all souls who are, invited to have a personal relationship with God. We are all, by Christ, invited to sit at the same table, and there's a humanizing influence, I would say, about the theology that's sort of happening. But all these sort of things come together such that nowadays we cannot escape a sense of the individual is the center of gravity for all political and moral thought. But then, as you say, you go to Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's just a totally different world. I don't see why that has to be like. Mindset. Yeah, go on. Yeah.
And that reminded me of what we were just saying earlier. Like, wouldn't it be great if atheists and Christians could all walk into the same room together and say, "We're broken and we can't fix it on our own." So is individualism the best thing to be pushing?
Right.
And you'll have people on the right and the left, and religious and atheists, who scream at you, because there's so many people who kind of glorify the individual as the warrior. We've become warriors because we have that individual warrior mentality in our head.
And I think the common opponent then to the Jonathan Haidt project is this Enlightenment individualism that sees the self as the unit of political and moral thought. And you see a lot of post-liberal thinkers that are saying, no, we're woven together in families and communities, and we need each other so much. And so, maybe one of the big differences that's happening is not between atheist and Christian, or, religious people and non-religious people, but between those who question the Enlightenment dogma that I am an individual.
Yeah, I've said that several times, that when I get into these arguments, I'll say I don't really see it as atheist versus religious. I see it as different battles, but one is like what you're saying, is whether you're individual or we're part of a whole. And I've even said that sometimes it's some people see meaning as something that has to be above us, that we can tap into, that applies to everybody. And some people see meaning as something that has to come within us, and it has to be momentary and fleeting, and it could go the other way. And they'll say, if meaning comes from above us, then it doesn't count. It has to be inside of us, and it has to be something that can go away and could turn awful. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything. But then the people who says meaning has to come up here, they're just the opposite. They're like, if it doesn't come up here, then it's not really meaning. And if it's just something that we do, then it's not really meaning. So sometimes I say that's kind of the dividing line, more so than atheism versus theism.
Right. And so you would say, I mean, I guess your ministry is kind of based on the fact that, like, you think there are some states of being that are better than others, and that it would be better for people to move towards this higher ideal, whatever that is, in terms of the way that we relate. So you believe in the meaning thing that's outside of us, I'd say?
I would say that we might have to create it. One thing I like to talk about, there's two, I'll just go over them briefly, and we can go into more deeply some other time. But I always think of like a songbird. When a songbird is born, there's like a song out there that's waiting for him. And it's coming from the other males in his group or whatever. But when he's born, he's already got the wiring in him, and the wiring is saying, you're going to sing the song, you're going to be part of the song, and it's going to be a big part of your life. But he's just been born, so he's like, what are you talking about? Where's my mom? Where's my food? Where am I? Why is it cold? So he's not even thinking about it, but it's in there inside of him. And then that song is immaterial, and it's out there waiting on him. But he is going to grow into it, and he's going to take up that song, and he's going to pass it forward to future generations. So did God create that song, or did the other songbirds create that song? Whatever. But it is out there, and it's a big part of his existence. And he does have biology inside of him that knows that it's going to be eventually. So in that extent, it is kind of external. Whether it was created just on our planet or not, that, I'm an atheist, so I suspect that it was. But there it is. And so in that respect, it's outside of us, but maybe not from a supernatural being. But definitely, I see it that way. And one other example is there was this is a little bit more practical and related to humans, is that there was a scientist called Eleanor Ostrom, and I don't know if she was from your side or our side, but and I think she's a non-believer, but she might have been UK or American, I don't remember. But she studied cultures who had to share common pool resources. And this is where she really studied the tragedy of the commons, which is like if you have a bunch of communities sharing a field or sharing a lake, you could all kill each other trying to share that lake, or you could come up with new rules that all the communities with all their different traditions, they would say, okay, we have to create like a United Nations here and come up with rules that apply to all of us. So in this case, the humans created new rules that empowered and constrained and were imposed over them, which they all had to obey. And if they obeyed it, then they got to share the lake for generations. And if they didn't obey these rules, then they would kill each other or they would destroy the field or whatever. So she called those common core principles. But they were principles that were created for these communities with different deities and different rules and different cultural norms. But they agreed to it. And because they agreed to it, they were able to share the resources. And she found that at various spots around the world and at various points in history. And they came down to like 7 or 8 common core principles. And again, is that because God made it? Or is it because through trial and error we came up with it? And those are the only principles that would work. So this group over here, 10,000 years later, and this group over here from some other place found the same 8 principles. Is it because they're objective rules, or are they because it's the only thing that would work in those situations? I don't know. But it is something that was imposed on the communities, and they had to agree to do it. And when they did it, they were able to keep surviving. So in that extent, it is kind of external.
I wonder how tinted the lenses are we have when we look around the world at how people share resources like that. Because I wonder how much in our care and fairness loving West, in our sort of modern 21st century moment, we would love to see communities be more caring and fairer in the distribution. And we might look at like a Sparta in the ancient world and think, ooh, not so sure about, the way they're, practicing infanticide and it's gender based and it's, ableist and it's all those sorts of things that with our modern care and fairness spectacles on, we instantly react against, because if it's just about the survival of the group, at some point you can trade off individuals against the survival of the group, and that can violate some of our deepest principles of especially care, in those sorts of senses. So what is it that protects things like, human rights and value and compassion for the weak and that sort of thing that sort of warms the cockles of our Christianized hearts? How do we square that circle?
I do have a naturalist idea on this. And I usually, so I'm at the point now where sometimes a Christian organization or a church will ask me to come talk about morality from a naturalist point of view. In fact, I think I'm going to debate Eric Hernandez on this in a few months. But my naturalist take on this, and again, I read a lot of books on this, but just like a quick overview, is that the game theory. Have you ever heard game theory?
Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah.
So if you have like self-interested individuals competing with each other for resources, then sure, the best one is going to win and the other ones are going to lose. But sometimes through biology, whether at the cell level or you can think of ants, sometimes they work together and then they outcompete the selfish individuals. So a group of cooperators can outcompete a selfish individual because they're working together. So like in a group of lions, maybe there's one dominant, super awesome, great fighter lion, and there's three who aren't, each individual is nowhere near as good as him, but the three together can just run circles around him. They can out-hunt him, and he can't beat all three of them, and because of that, cooperation gets rewarded. Yes. So I talk about self-interest is one way of doing business. Cooperation is another way of doing business. And then the third way, and I think natural selection created this one, I call it zealotry. And zealotry is like a super hyper cooperation, but only if you're one of us and only if you obey the rules. So zealotry is, man, I love you to death, but you got to be with me. If you're with me, then I love you to death. However, if I catch you breaking the rules, I'm going to turn on you. And the neighbors are going to turn on you, and you're going to get kicked out, excommunicated. And zealotry can really work. You take a group of people who just cooperate, that second level. Well, hey, we're just going to cooperate. One selfish person could go into a village of cooperators and he could ruin the whole village because no matter what he does, they got to keep cooperating with him because they're supposed to cooperate. He could destroy the whole village. But a group of zealots, if that one individual walks in, chances are they're going to kill him right off the bat. And if they don't kill him, he's going to have to be really minding his P's and Q's and learning the new ways and fitting in with those rules that they find sacred. So between self-interest and cooperation and zealotry, I think that's where our morality comes from. So that you say, okay, there's times where I need to make my own way and make sure that I'm taking care of myself. There's times where I need to, cooperate with people. And then there's times where there's these really fierce ideals that matter. And I need to defend that, even if it's not going well for me. I need to sacrifice myself to keep this idea going. And although that might sound irrational, especially if it's an idea that you don't agree with, I think humans that have some wiring for that zealotry and for that fierce defense of ideas, even at your own individual well-being, that's opposite of self-interest. That's completely giving yourself to an idea. A lot of our morality comes from that. So when we think of morality, it's not just always cooperating and thinking of others. Sometimes it's taking a stand and being willing to go down or lose something in defense of an idea. And I think that's because game theory made it so that sometimes self-interest works, sometimes cooperation works, and sometimes zealotry works. And I think we're a mix of those. I think we're a mix of those three forces.
So the Spartans might be zealous for creating a warrior race and therefore will cooperate against those who they perceive to be weaker and eliminate them so that they can become, a stronger warrior race. And then another society might have the zealous idea that we should protect the weak and that a society should be judged by the way it treats its weakest members, and therefore think it's horrible to have infanticide, and so refuses not to. Is there anything that stands above those two cultures and says the Spartans are wrong and those guys are right?
Well, and this is where people, hate to hear some subjectivity and relativism and postmodernism and all that, but you take did you guys ever get Little House on the Prairie over there in the UK?
In Australia, we did when I was growing up. Yeah, okay. Night John Boy and all that. Yeah.
So I was raised on that show, even though my dad's a non-believer. My dad always saw religion as like a salesmanship. He still does. He still sees religion as like, hey, come on over here. You help me out, and I'll help you out later. So he wasn't religious, but he did raise me on Little House on the Prairie, and he was like, Charles Ingalls is he is the standard. And even though he wasn't religious, he saw Charles Ingalls as this Christian father, sort of the standard. I would say that if the Charles Ingalls village, Walnut Grove, was in the conditions of Sparta, then they would have lost. Whereas if Sparta was placed in the position of Walnut Grove, it would have been horrendous. But Walnut Grove, in the position that it was, in the time and place that it was, it worked out really well. Whereas Sparta, in the time and place, you needed to be that if you were going to have a chance. So I know that's a relativist answer, but I think our surrounding conditions really matter. So that's my postmodern, nothing means anything answer.
Well, but yeah, and at that stage, you can't say that Walnut Grove is a better moral system. It's well adapted for its environment, and Sparta's well adapted for its environment, and neither is better than the other.
Or at least, it's hard for me to compare them, but I do think that humans are so flexible, and I don't mean this to be in a bad way. I think we're so flexible that if we're suddenly put in Sparta conditions, some people are going to be able to rise up and jump in line. And there's going to be a lot of human atrocities when that happens. Within Sparta, there's going to be a lot of human value atrocities because suddenly we're going to have to be Spartans. Whereas if we're in Walnut Grove conditions, I think a lot of people are going to be able to fit in. Some of the warriors are going to have to calm down a little bit. And so I think we're flexible. And I think that's part of the beauty of being alive, is trying to figure out what situation you're in and deciding which wiring system you're going to ramp up. And it's hard for me to compare. It's hard for me to say. I think either you said you're like this or you wonder if I'm like this. I do try to scale back and look on it down as if I'm not a participant and say, this is what you're going to need to do. Whether it's right or not, or whether it should be, this is what you need to do. And I also realize that could be horrifying if I'm in Nazi Germany. And I'm like, hey, this is unfortunate, but if you're going to, raise your family, you're going to need to shut up about this horrible things that are going on and just be quiet. I don't want to be that guy either. So what I'm pitching is not necessarily the answer to all the questions. It's just, I think a lot of people make decisions like this. They say, hey, what's going on? What do I need to do to survive in this?
Right.
And then you might become more like Sparta or more like Walnut Grove. And I don't know that there's one objective answer that's going to make God smile or frown. So this is a complexity that I wrestle with.
Yeah. Well, I think here's a benefit of the Christian worldview. I think you can maintain the language of atrocity. And I can completely agree that if I lived in Nazi Germany, the odds of me standing up heroically against the Nazi evil are absolutely, criminally negligible.
Right, I understand that, and I don't think any less of you. I think it's a very honest answer, and it's more like a horrifying thing, not something that
Right.
Right. Yeah,
Right.
I get that.
No, exactly. No, we would all wish that we were the person who stood up against the, there's that image on Facebook that you see every now and again, this meme of everyone else is giving the Heil Hitler and there's just one guy kind of folding his arms, and we all think that we would be that guy, but the odds of us being that guy are quite small.
Yep, exactly.
But I think the benefit of the Christian worldview is to be able to say no. Even in that moment, in his context, he was doing the right thing, they were doing the wrong thing. That was the atrocity, that was the good thing. There is an up, there is a down. However naive that sounds, I think that does certainly accord with what I feel to be our deepest moral intuitions.
Right. I'll grant you that one. I think for that particular one, whenever people talk about objective morals, and I've been, like I said before, I've been following the apologetics now since 1987. I think the first person who said you wouldn't torture babies for fun, I think that might have been Josh McDowell. I haven't checked with him or Sean McDowell, but that's the first time I heard it was from Josh McDowell, in 1993. So I think there are some things that are so awful that even maybe across generations, everyone's like, "Ooh, no, I wouldn't do that." So yeah, the torture of just purely innocent people who couldn't have possibly had time to learn or try to fit in. I think we all kind of impulsively get disgusted with that, and disgust is a powerful tool. So
yeah. It's funny. I've actually traveled in a different direction in doing my research for The Air We Breathe and looking at sort of comparative anthropology. It's very rare to find cultures that don't practice infanticide. For instance, it's not quite a human universal. You can find some cultures that don't do it, but they are the exceptions. And the rule seems to be and it's overwhelmingly girls and the disabled that fall foul of this.
Right, I understand. Yeah, and again, is that because God made it that way, or is it because in this cruel and different cosmos, if you're the kind of culture that doesn't have something like this, then you're not going to make it very long. Is it trial and error and luck, or is it because it's created for us and discoverable? I don't know. But I will say, whether I'm talking to a Christian or an atheist, I'm like, still adhere to it, still follow it. And if I'm wrong and it's created for me, then I'm happy that I'm wrong about that. And if it is trial and error and luck, then at least we're doing it. So I try to be pragmatic about that.
Yeah. No, that comes across. I had a conversation with Adam. Oh, I've forgotten his last name. Another massive Jonathan Haidt fan on YouTube, and this is a few years going back now. But Adam Friended is the name of his YouTube channel.
I know him.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
He was actually in this game with us back in 2015, 2016. He was in this game too.
Right.
Jonathan Haidt, tribalism.
Yes.
He was. Interestingly, he and Brett Weinstein, do you know Brett Weinstein?
Yep.
Both of those guys were in this, they were like you. So I remember way back then saying, man, Adam Friended, Brett Weinstein, they understand this tribalism stuff. And yet both Adam Friended and Brett Weinstein both sort of slipped into the anti-woke tribe. So much that now all their stuff is anti-woke. And there's real problems with the woke authoritarian, especially if you're on the left and free speech is your thing, then the woke, authoritarian woke should be problematic to you. But it was interesting for me to see Adam Friended and Brett Weinstein teach tribalism and then sort of fall into tribalism. Yes. So it kind of shows me how powerful tribalism is.
Yeah, and it shows me how powerful the algorithm is and audience capture. It's so interesting. You think of online influencers as the ones who are directing the trends, whereas actually they're chasing the trending hashtags and they're tracing the numbers, and then they find an audience for something, and then they double down on it. And you just, like I see it, you can go to Google Analytics and look at the videos that do good numbers, and you can absolutely be led around by the algorithm and not by any sense of mission in what you want to say. Right,
and I think it's interesting. As I've been talking before about, I'll give a presentation about how we're getting more radicalized in the social media world, and I'll say there's two things going on. There's the non-conscious elephant going towards the water in this situation. So the people who are following the algorithms, their elephant is attracted to it and they're going towards it, and the writer doesn't see it consciously. He just thinks this is righteous and makes sense, and he's checking off all the boxes as the elephant's going towards it. And at the same time, the social media algorithms, they're not trying to radicalize us. They're just trying to keep us at the computer. And so they'll put up flashes of pretty people and pretty scenery and do all these things to try to keep us there. But they find that the controversy keeps us there. Once they see what we find important, then they just try to make it a little bit more controversial. And they're not being surgical about it. They're just saying, I want you to stay at the computer. And it works. If it's controversial, it turns out that controversial topics that you care about will keep you at the computer more than pretty people, more than pretty scenery, more than cute kittens. And social media didn't create that about us. It just found that works.
Right.
So I think the only way out of it is to be horrified by it and try to, not click so much. I treat it with the same thing that I do with pretty people. If there's my kids needed an app, so I downloaded the app so they could do their app thing. And when I opened up on mine, there's pretty people. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'll watch this. But then another part of me was like, well, hold on, Colin, you can do this all day, and there's other things to do. So I just don't click. And so I think if you treat controversial topics the same way and not chase it, even if it feels like you should, maybe that's a way for the algorithms not to work. And then maybe if enough people do that, then maybe the algorithms won't work so well.
Wow, I think that's very wise. I think I could leverage within the Christian community. I think you could leverage that by just saying, you know what to do about lust, don't you? You have a category for this. Jesus taught about it in the Sermon on the Mount. And isn't that fascinating that outrage is more enslaving to our eyes than lust is? Wow.
Right.
Wow.
And again, the algorithms aren't being mean, because we just said keep them at the computer. That was the only instructions, and the algorithms had to find out what that was. And,
it's all
and then
our
they
fault.
found it.
Yeah. It's the human heart, but yeah, supercharged. Richard, you have been an absolute gentleman. What a joy to talk to you. Now, I think everybody should go absolutely for a start to Facebook and like the page, the Faithiest Atheist, and it's a wonderful follow, and you won't be disappointed. Richard Suttles, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Glenn.